On the morning of the 15th of March, 44 BC, Julius Caesar woke up and chose to ignore every warning he had been given. His wife Calpurnia had dreamed of his murder. She wept. She begged him not to leave the house. His priests performed the morning sacrifices and found the omens so consistently terrible that they advised him to stay home. A soothsayer whose name history has preserved, a man named Spurina, had warned him weeks earlier to beware the Ides of March. Caesar had seen Spurina that very morning on the way to the Senate, and reportedly said to him, with the casual confidence of a man who has survived a decade of civil war, "The Ides of March have come." Spurina looked at him and replied, "Aye, they have come, but they have not yet gone." Caesar went inside anyway. Within 3 hours, he would be dead on the floor of the Theatre of Pompey, stabbed 23 times by men he considered colleagues, allies, and, in at least one case, a friend he had treated like a son. 23 senators, some of them so frantic in the chaos of the attack that they accidentally stabbed each other reaching for him. And here is the thing that every account of this story skips over entirely. The men who killed Julius Caesar did not save Rome. They did not restore the republic they claimed to love. They did not prevent the concentration of power they feared. They created the exact conditions that made everything they hated permanent, inevitable, and far more total than anything Caesar himself had ever attempted. This is code underneath the most famous political murder in human history. To understand what went wrong, you need to understand what Julius Caesar actually was. Not what his enemies said he was, not the tyrant of legend, not the king who needed to be stopped. What the historical record shows he actually was, and what the men who killed him actually feared. Because the distance between those two things is where the entire story lives. Caesar was not a king. Rome did not have kings. The Romans had expelled their last king 5 centuries earlier, and the word itself was considered so toxic that even suggesting someone wanted to be king was political poison. Caesar held the title of Dictator Perpetual, dictator in perpetuity. This sounds ominous to modern ears, but it was a legal Roman office, granted to him by the Senate itself, by the very institution that later orchestrated his murder. The Senate gave him the title. The Senate then killed him for having it. He had spent the previous decade doing things that made him genuinely popular with the ordinary people of Rome. He had reformed the calendar. The Julian calendar he created is essentially the calendar the Western world still uses today, 2,000 years later. He had extended Roman citizenship to people in the provinces who had been fighting for Rome for generations without legal recognition. He had begun ambitious building programs that gave work to the poor. He had canceled a portion of the debts crushing the lower classes. None of this made him popular with the Senate. The Senate was not worried about tyranny in the abstract. They were worried about their own power, their own land, their own position in a Roman hierarchy that Caesar's reforms were quietly dismantling from underneath them. The conspiracy to kill him was not a principled stand for democracy. It was a coalition of men who had calculated, correctly, that they were personally losing influence under Caesar's rule, and who had convinced themselves that removing him would reverse that loss. They were wrong, in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The conspiracy that Julius Caesar involved 23 senators. This was its fatal weakness before a single blade was drawn. Successful conspiracies are small. The more people who know about a plan to assassinate the most powerful man in Rome, the more opportunities exist for someone to lose their nerve, to seek personal advantage by informing, or to simply tell the wrong person in an unguarded moment. 23 people is not a conspiracy. It is a secret that is already half told. Caesar was warned, multiple times. In the days before the Ides of March, a senator named Artemidorus prepared a written document naming the conspirators and their plan and attempted to hand it directly to Caesar in the street. Caesar took it. He did not read it. He was surrounded by people requesting his attention, as he always was, and the document stayed in his hand, unread, as he walked into the Theatre of Pompey where the Senate was meeting that day. The conspirators had chosen their moment carefully. They waited until Caesar was seated. They had arranged for Mark Antony, Caesar's most capable and dangerous ally, to be detained outside in conversation, removed from the room at the critical moment. Then a senator named Tullius Cimber approached Caesar with a petition, a request for the recall of his exiled brother. Caesar began to decline. Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga with both hands and pulled it down from his shoulder. That was the signal. The first blade was drawn by a senator named Servilius Casca. He struck at Caesar's neck and missed, cutting his shoulder instead. Caesar grabbed the blade with his hand. He looked at Casca and said in Latin, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" And then the others came. 23 men in a confined space, all attempting to stab the same person, created immediate chaos. Men stabbed over each other's shoulders. Men who could not reach Caesar stabbed at the air. In the frenzy, several of the conspirators wounded each other. Caesar fought back initially. He was a soldier, a man who had spent years in active military campaigns. But against 23 assailants in a confined space, there was nothing to be done. He pulled his toga over his face as he fell, arranging his clothing so that he would die with dignity rather than exposure. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, his former rival and enemy, and died there. 23 wounds. Only one of them was definitively fatal, according to the physician who later examined the body. And then the conspirators stood in the sudden silence of what they had done, blades in their hands, blood on their togas, and realized something that none of them appeared to have genuinely planned for. They had no idea what to do next. Brutus, who had been the moral center of the conspiracy, the man whose involvement had given it the appearance of principle rather than self-interest, apparently believed that killing Caesar would be sufficient, that the Roman people, upon hearing that the dictator was dead, would spontaneously celebrate the restoration of republican values, that the Senate would simply resume its traditional functions, that power, having been removed from one man, would naturally redistribute itself back to its rightful holders. None of that happened. The Senate fled the building in panic. The Roman people did not celebrate. They were frightened and confused. The streets filled with rumor. Shops closed. People locked their doors. The city that the conspirators had expected to greet them as liberators greeted them instead with the silence of a population that did not know what was coming next and was afraid to find out. Mark Antony, detained outside during the assassination, received the news and made an immediate calculation. He did not flee. He did not panic. He secured Caesar's personal documents, his private correspondence, his financial records, and his will. He positioned himself as the executor of Caesar's legacy before the conspirators had finished cleaning the blood from their hands, and he began to plan. Caesar's funeral was the moment the conspirators lost everything, and they lost it to a single speech. Mark Antony stood before the Roman people in the Forum and delivered what became one of the most consequential pieces of public oratory in human history. He did not attack the conspirators directly. He was too intelligent for that. Instead, he read Caesar's will aloud to the crowd. Caesar had left money to every Roman citizen. He had left his private gardens to the Roman people as a public park. He had remembered, in death, the ordinary Romans who had always been his political base. Then Antony held up Caesar's toga, the one he had died in, still blood-stained. He pointed to each tear in the fabric and named the senator whose blade had made it. The crowd did not remain calm. The Roman Forum became a place of grief and rage within minutes. People tore apart wooden benches and market stalls to build an impromptu funeral pyre for Caesar in the middle of the city. The conspirators, who had been cautiously beginning to appear in public believing the worst was over, fled Rome within hours. Brutus and Cassius left the city with such speed they abandoned most of their possessions. They would never return. What followed was 17 years of civil war. Mark Antony, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted son, Octavian, and a general named Lepidus formed what history calls the Second Triumvirate, a formal alliance to hunt down Caesar's assassins and consolidate power. They published lists of their political enemies. Hundreds of senators and wealthy Romans were declared outlaws, their property confiscated, their lives forfeit. It was systematic political elimination on a scale Rome had rarely seen. Every single one of the 23 assassins was dead within 3 years of the Ides of March. Cassius, who had been the organizational mind behind the conspiracy, died at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, killed by his own servant at his own request after misreading the battle and believing falsely that all was lost. Brutus, the moral conscience of the conspiracy, the man whose name has become synonymous with noble betrayal, died at the same battle 20 days later, also by his own hand. The men who had killed Caesar to save the Republic watched the Republic die, and then died themselves without seeing anything they had worked for come to pass. Octavian eventually outmaneuvered Antony as well, defeating him and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Antony took his own life. Octavian returned to Rome, accepted the title Augustus from a grateful Senate, and became the first emperor of Rome. The Senate that had killed Caesar to prevent one man holding permanent power formally handed permanent power to one man and called it something different. The Roman Republic, which had functioned in some form for nearly 500 years, was gone. In its place was an empire that would last, in the West, for another 500 years, and in the East for nearly 1,500 more. The 23 men who stabbed Julius Caesar on the Ides of March 44 BC had wanted to preserve a system of shared governance that had made Rome great. What they actually did was demonstrate so comprehensively that the system had already broken down, that no one man's removal could fix it, that the only stable solution anyone could find was to give one man everything and call him emperor instead of dictator. They removed a man who held too much power. They created a system that gave one man all the power permanently, and surrounded it with enough ceremony and tradition that it lasted for centuries. Caesar had been warned about the Ides of March and walked in anyway. The men who killed him had been warned by everyone who understood Roman politics that removing Caesar would not restore the Republic, and they acted anyway. History rarely suffers from a shortage of warnings. It suffers from a shortage of people who believe the warnings apply to them. The Roman Empire. Caesar's assassins accidentally created, outlasted every one of them by 1,000 years. His name, the name they tried to erase from Roman power, became a title. Caesar, Kaiser, Czar. Every language that wanted a word for supreme ruler reached for the name of the man 23 senators tried to make forgettable on the 15th of March, 44 BC. I take the events everyone thinks they know, and I show you what is underneath them. If this gave you something you did not have before, subscribe. A new episode every single week, and the next one goes even deeper than this one did.